Okay.
All right, Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and Gemar Chatima Tova, and good to see everybody who is here, who's with us on Zoom, everybody who's with us on YouTube. It's Shabbat Shuvah, this interim Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which makes it an interesting Shabbat liturgically, and it makes it an interesting Shabbat for you to have chosen to show up for shul, even if you're showing up for online shul, and that brings me joy for us to be together. And showing up is always good, and especially good at times when you could say, "I've had enough synagogue," but there's never enough. It's always good to be showing up. So we're going to begin our service as we always do on Shabbat afternoons on page 214 in our Lev Shalom Siddur, page 226 in the newer Sim Shalom, page 558 in the older Sim Shalom Siddur. Ashrei Yoshevei Veitecha, Od Yalelucha Sela, Ashrei Am Shekacha Lo, Ashrei Am Shadonai Elohad, Teila LeDavid. Tehillat Adonai Yidaber Pi, V'yarech kol basar shem kodsho le'olam va'ed, V'anachnu nevarech ya, V'yatav yad olam Alleluia. Continue on the following page. Uvalet Zion goel shavei feshav Yaakov nu Adonai, V'ani sabriti. V'yata kadosh yoshev tehillat Yisrael, v'karazel ze v'yamar, kadosh 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 Adonai tzavahot, melech ol haaretz kevodo. V'tisaini ruach v'shmai chorai kol rash gadol, baruch kivod Adonai mimekomot. Adonai lo le'olam va'ed, Adonai. V'yiftechu b'cha yodei shemecha, ki lo azavta doreshecha Adonai, Adonai chafetz leman tzidko, yagdil Torah v'yadir. So we'll pause there in our service in the Siddur to move into our learning, our Torah portion learning for this afternoon. We are all the way up to Ha'azinu, which is Moshe, our prophet, our, what's the word I'm looking for? It's the standalone prophet. There's a fancy word for it. Not enigmatic. I can't think of the word. The really cool standalone prophet, Moshe. Lo kam Yisrael Moshe od. There is no other prophet who was like Moshe. And he gets up and recites a poem of wisdom to his people before they cross over to the Jordan. And this past week's Torah portion, as of this morning on Vayelach, we end sort of with a colon. And here is what he said. And then we end our Torah portion. This coming week in Ha'azinu, we get that teaching. And that's what I'm about to read from the beginning of Ha'azinu. We begin with a blessing, thanking God for the opportunity to study Torah with all of you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Hazinu hashamayim v'adabeira v'tishmar zimrei fi Yarov kamatar lichi Jizal katal imrati Yesirim malei deshe V'chirvivi malei esev Ki Shem Adonai ekra Havu God el Eloheinu Hatzur tamim palo Ki chol drachav mishpat el emunah v'inavel Tzadik v'yashar shichet lo banamum Dori keish uftal tol Hal Adonai tiglu v'zot Am naval Elohacham Halohu avicha kanecha Hu asecha v'chonanecha Zichor imot olam binu Shenot dor vador Shahal avicha v'yakedcha Sekenecha v'yomerhu lach V'ncha el yom goyim V'afrido b'nei adam Yatsev gevulot amim Lemispar b'nei Israel Ki chelek Adonai hamo Yaakov chavel nachalato Yimtzai b'eretz midbar Uvtohu yelel yeshimon Yesovavenu yevon anehu Yitzrehu keishoneno Kenesher yair kino All goes alav Yirachef Yivrahush kenafav yikachehu Yisahehu alevrato Adonai badad yanechenu V'nimahu El Nechar. So that's Hazinu. It's Parshat Hazinu, the beginning aliyah for this coming week, which we anticipate with great joy, but hard to remember that there's something past Yom Kippur right now, since that's coming in this next week. When we return after the Whispered Amidah to some Torah study itself, we'll be taking a look at one of the verses from the very beginning of the Parsha, verse 4, Hatzur Tamim Po'alo Kol Drechav Mishpat El Emunah Ve'ein Avel Tzadik V'yasharhu, which appears to be about how God, who is Hatzur, we often call God the rock. It's one of the many names of God, like Tzur Yisrael, Kuma Bezrat Yisrael, we're used to in the Shacharit service, the paragraph that precedes the Amidah in the Shacharit service. It appears to be a sentence about God's perfection, and more specifically about God's perfectness as a wielder of mishpat, of judgment. And we're going to study that concept, not only because it's Parsha appropriate, but because it's appropriate for this week, anticipating the judgment that takes place on Yom Kippur, and during this week anticipating Yom Kippur. So we'll come back to that in a few minutes. We're about to go to the Amidah. Before I do, is there anyone who is anticipating an El Male Rachamim to be said for a loved one this week, marking a yahrzeit this week? Okay, so we'll move now to the whispered private Amidah for Shabbat afternoon. A few extra notes for you. So we do this on page 223 in Love Shalom. We're on page 234 in the newer Sim Shalom, 574 in the older Sim Shalom. Don't forget, please, that whatever Siddur you're in, you'll have insertions in there for Shabbat Shuvah. Those insertions exist on the page. They're printed on the page. They're there every week. We're used to skipping over them with our eyes. Don't skip over them. This is the week to stop, concentrate, pay attention. For those of you, those of us who are stalwarts, who are regular tefillah folks, who are regular prayers, this is the week in which our rote tefillah is disrupted. We are disrupted and we are told slow down. We insert these extra Michamocha verses, these extra Zochrenu verses, these extra verses B'Sefer Chaim, mid-paragraph at Shalom Rav at the end. So don't miss these 5 special insertions or changes within the Whisper Private Amidah. Again, 223, 234, 574. It's recited privately whispered per my last week's teaching and standing. If you have not yet completed your own whispered Amidah, please continue at your own pace. We are going to continue now with Aleinu on pages 281 or 297 or 696. You can rise or remain standing for Aleinu. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon ha'kol l'tiknu l'adam separashit shalom. אנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ויאמרו יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Mourner's Kaddish is found on pages 232, 249, or page 600. Don't forget, if you're reciting this along with me, that we're in the season during these Aseret Yemei Shuvah, these 10 days, in which we add an extra le'ela in the latter paragraph. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah, Be'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei, B'chaye chon uvyome chon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael, Ba'agala uvizman kari ve'imru amen. Yehi shemei Rabbah mevarach le'alam ulamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yit hadar, v'yit ale, v'yit halal, shemeh dekudsha berichu, le'ela, le'ela, mikol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael Ve'imru. Amen. So you could be seated if you were standing, and we'll continue now with some learning together. As I shared before, we're going to be delving into the fourth line of the Ha'azinu poem. I happen to be a big fan of the Ha'azinu poem. I like poetry. I like that Ha'azinu packs a big punch in very few words. It manages to do what a lot of our blessings and curses partiot. I can never decide if I like parashot or partiot better. It does a better job packing a punch with these than fully prosaic parshas do. But at the beginning of Ha'azinu, we're just in the territory of Moshe praising the type of divine being and creator with whom he wants to leave his people in relationship. Moshe wants to leave Moshe's people, in relationship with God. And he's pointing out the characteristics of God. He's continuing to give God names. He's framing God. Framing not as in framing him for a crime, but framing the divine, giving a framework for the type of divine presence that God is going to be in their practical lives, because we are moving into a time canonically, historically, and literarily, as you follow the history of the Jews after Deuteronomy, when the Jews are going into the land as led by Yehoshua, and they're going to be dealing as a people, but they are still intended to be in relationship with the divine. It's a mirror image of the two types of judgment, and this is the subject of our interest today, of the two types of judgment and the two types of relationship with which we concern ourselves at this time of year, during Elul, and particularly during the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, these 10 days of repentance between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That is, the horizontal and the vertical, which are metaphorical axes on which we relate to our human siblings, right? The people who live around us, whom we have to treat with and deal with respectfully, and also the relationship that we have with the divine. Metaphorical because we don't strictly relate to human beings as being lateral to us and God as being exactly above. But you see what I mean, right? The vertical and the horizontal axes. But this is what Moshe is dealing with too. Moshe is doubly preparing the people as he's getting ready to leave them. He's preparing them to create a just society, and he's preparing them to be and stay in relationship with the divine, even though he, as the conduit so often, right? Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Vaidaber Moshe, right? So often have we read this. He's been the conduit, but he wants the people to be in relationship. Okay, so we're going to look at this verse 4, and we're going to look at this one piece that our tradition and interpreters of our tradition have wrestled with understanding, because Moshe puts forward an idea in this poem about who God is as a judge, as a shofet, even though he doesn't use this word. That's kind of troubling, especially as we stare down the day of Yom Kippur in just a few days. And we really can grapple with this in live, real, approaching Yom Kippur time as we look at the many commentaries that our tradition has gone through on this very verse. Hatzur tamim poalo. Hatzur, the rock. As I said before, Sur Yisrael, Kuma Bezrat Yisrael. Tzur is not just rock, it's a name that's given to God in the Torah here, in other places biblically, and poetically and liturgically. Tamim po'alo. The things that God acts upon are tamim. They are perfect and whole. Tamim is the word that opens a wormhole for so many people, that bothers, that itches at the brains and the hearts of so many of our ancestors. What do you mean God is perfect? Let's keep going in the verse. Ki kol derachav mishpat. And they take this next bit as an expansion upon that word tamim, because ki either means when or because, and it probably means because in this verse. Kol derachav, all of God's ways, their ways. Mishpat. Mishpat can mean judgment, but as an adjective mean just. As a noun can also be justice. And then a secondary thought, El Emunah Ve'ein Avel. He is in El Emunah. Like either that's a name for God, God is God Emunah, right? El Emunah. Does that sound like a name of a synagogue to you? It sounds like a name of a synagogue to me. El Emunah. We could start a synagogue called El Emunah, right? If Mozambique needs you always need two shuls, right? The one you go to, the one you don't go to. So Larry, if Mozambique needs the one that they don't go to, we can name it El Emunah. Ve'ein Avel, that can be the third shul. And there's no falsehood, which is probably just a tikbolet. It's just saying the same thing, but saying it in the inverse. Tzaddik v'yasharhu. What is God? God is tzaddik, is righteous, which is interesting because we don't typically refer to God as tzaddik, right? Tzaddik is typically a humanity correlated word in the Bible. You just take my word for that. It is. And yashar, straight. Okay. We're really going to dig into those first two lines. What does it mean for God to be tamim in po'alo? What does it mean for God to be perfect in God's ways? Something about mishpat, something about God's judgment is perfect. And this bothers people. Who does this bother? This bothers me. Anyone else bothered by this? How could God's judgment be perfect? Absolutely bothers me. This particularly bothers me, I'm sure, because I grew up in a country that has an appeals system in its courts, right? I grew up with fallible judges, or believing that courts and judgments could be fallible, that we set up checks and balances in our system because perhaps someone could be wrong. And even if I believe in a perfect divine, I struggle with the idea that God is tamim bepo'alo b'mishpat, that justice is executed perfectly because I look at the world around me and I struggle to see that justice is happening even on a divine level. And I'll spare the examples for the moment because I think that you're going to see the grappling that people did with these verses over time. Remember that our commentators are humans just like us in the verses ahead, in the commentaries ahead. Who would like to read for us our 11th to 13th century school of Rashi? In the English is just fine with me. Someone read for us Rashi on this, trying to understand Hatsur Tamim. Someone read us the Rashi, please. Gary and Marlise.
Okay. The rock, his work is perfect. Although he is strong, Hatsur,
Perfect.
yet when he brings punishment upon those who transgress his will, he does not bring it in a flood of anger, but in deliberate judgment, because Tamim Lo, his work is perfect.
Great. Okay, Marlise, I'm gonna parse this in uh, in give you a lens, a view into what I think is happening with Rashi's school in this moment. If you read enough rabbinic literature, you learn that ha before a noun often turns that thing into a question.
Hmm.
So let's read let's read that Hatsur for a moment, which is funny, it gets stuck there. You read it beautifully inside the English translation. Hatsur, isn't God this big, strong rock of a God? Right? God, Hatsur? God is this big, strong rock. Couldn't God, remember God holding the mountain over Israel's head? Couldn't God just be a rock and slam punishment down upon us? And yet, when God brings punishment upon those who are transgressors to God's will, God doesn't bring it in a flood of anger, mevi kimbadin, because he's tamim po'alo. He could bring it in a flood of anger, but he does it like a judge. God could just God could just continue to open up the earth, right? We don't see that again nowadays, though. We don't see people swallowed up by earth most of the time. What does God do? God does it like a judge. So Rashi's explanation on this is Hatsur Mitamim Poalo. God is a rock, but his ways are perfect. And then he sees the next verse as the explanation of his ways being perfect. That is, Ki Kol Derachav Mishpat. All of his ways that see, his ways of doing mishpat. God executes divine judgment in such kindly ways, given what God could be doing, right? God could be just lightning bolting people left and right. See Greek mythology, right? But that's not what God chooses to do. Okay, we may or may not like this explanation for what Sur Tamim Poelo is and why that's a Tamim explanation for Mishpat. Let's go to the next piece, which is from Ta'anit. It's from the Bavli, Babylonian Talmud. And let's have somebody else read this either in this happens to be almost Hebrew. So you could read it in the Hebrew or in the English, whichever somebody's more comfortable doing. Either from Elamuna or from the Breita cites another verse. I can do it, but then you just have to listen to my voice more.
If you can screen share, unfortunately, my laptop overheated and on the iPad, I can't really see it well enough.
That's okay. I'm sorry that I can't do that because I'm not doing that on Shabbat itself.
Oh, got
But
it. Sorry about
in the
that. Sorry
future,
that I asked.
that's
Sorry.
okay.
I
I'm
did.
glad I'm glad you asked because I would love to have you participate. In the future, we will call upon you to participate. So I will read forward here. El Amuna ve'ein avel. That's that piece straight from the verse. So that's later in our verse, the second part of the verse. God is a God of faithfulness, ve'ein avel. I'm reading from here because the stuff in bold in the translation, that's actually in the Talmud. The rest is added by the translator to try to help it make sense. The Braita cites another verse that deals with judgment. That's El Emunah ve'ein avel, a God of faithfulness and without falseness or without iniquity. He is just and righteous. That's our verse. The Braita interprets El Emunah, a God of faithfulness, to mean that just as punishment is exacted from the wicked in Olam Haba, in the world to come, even for a light transgression. Got it? So wicked people get punished in the next world, even if they transgress a tiny bit. So too, punishment is exacted from the righteous in this world for a light transgression that they commit. Why? The translator adds the explanation here. So that the righteous suffer their punishment in this world to purify them so they can enjoy Olam Haba, they can enjoy the world to come. So what makes God such a good executor of justice in the view of the rabbis editing the Talmud here? What makes God such a great executor of justice if God punishes the wicked in the world to come, even for a light transgression, but righteous people get punished in this world? Brant?
Well, to me, the way I interpret this is that since nobody is truly wicked and nobody is truly righteous, that he both exacts something from the wicked and he exacts something from the righteous, so that and it's in God's time. It's not necessarily in man's time, which is why we're so troubled by the fact that wicked people aren't punished, more in front of our own eyes. We all know wicked people in our lives who don't seem to suffer. We know righteous people who suffer. We have all these. That's why we sometimes doubt the existence of God. But the reality is, we're all a little bit righteous. We're all a little bit wicked, and God's able to dice through that dichotomy of people, that they have the evil side and the righteous side, so that we both get rewarded and punished.
Bingo. I think that's the brilliance of this theology, Brant, is that it's an explanation for people watching others whom they perceive as being righteous suffer, and watching others whom they perceive as wicked not suffering. This is a helpful explanation. How could God possibly be meting out justice well, let alone perfectly, if we're watching righteous people suffer in this world and wicked people seem not to suffer? Well, righteous people are suffering now so that they can eternally enjoy the world to come, and the wicked people, they're not going to enjoy the next world at all, because even for the light transgressions they're going to suffer. So yes, I agree. I think that that's a meaningful way of dealing, whether it's a good way of dealing with it. I think it's a meaningful and reasonable way of dealing with those questions that we have that, like you said, sometimes make us doubt the existence of God. Yeah. Was there someone else who had something on that? Gary, did you want to add something?
My voice continued. No, it made sense. We're not smart enough to know what's going to happen, and I don't like that rationale and that stuff, but I can understand it from that standpoint that we don't know, and that we can understand that the evil evil continues. And evil will get to respond in the next world. If you believe strongly enough in the next world, that's going to happen.
Right. So we don't know what's coming. We have no proof of that. But if you believe strongly enough in it, perhaps that's helpful to you to believe that in the next world something's coming to those who deserve reward and those who deserve punishment. That's very insightful. Thank you, Gary. Let's go to the Dat Zakanim and their perspective, their school of thought on what makes God such a perfect judge. Okay, so this is another take on God's chazakness. It's another take on God's strength as judge and God's restraint. Hatsur tamim po'alo. The rock, God's work is perfect. It's only fair that you'll acknowledge God's greatness, that you give him godel, ki hutsur v'takif ve'osei pe'oto between mut ve'eno mar'eh. Seeing that God is unshakably strong, and therefore whatever God has created is perfect. Moreover, he doesn't display anger when facing those who are bent to make him display his anger. So, what is it about God that makes him so great as a judge and a giver of justice, that God is able to set anger in a different bucket and a different category than deserving of justice and what is justice? How many of us wrestle and struggle? In fact, how many of us see it as an ultimate human flaw? I certainly do. That it feels impossible to separate anger from punishment when we are in a place of power, when we are in a position of power. What the Dat Zakanim say is, God is Hatsur, God is Chazak. God could come and display God's wrath, but whatever God has created is perfect, and therefore God does not confuse wrath with justice. Dayenu, if I could have a little droplet of that in this year to come, that in any environment in which I am in a seat of power and I find myself needing to hand out consequences for something that takes place, that I am able to separate my anger from the setting out of a pathway of justice for somebody. That is tough. And so to see that as divine perfection is to understand the difference between divinity and humanity when it comes to justice. I happen to favorite that one. That is a big favorite of mine because I see that as a human and divine divide. At least one more. Let's get to the Mesilat Yesharim before we have to wrap, and we may get to one last one on the final page. We'll see. All this is evident and clear, for God is the God of truth, as Moshe Rabbeinu, peace be upon Moshe, I love the way that the Mesilat Yesharim speaks, said, Atzur, Tamim Po'alo, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness, and without iniquity, just and right is he. For since the Holy One, blessed be God, desires justice, to ignore the bad would be just as much an injustice as to ignore the good. Therefore, if it is justice that God desires, then God must pay each person according to their ways and according to the fruits of their deeds to absolute exactness, whether for good or for bad. Thus, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and right is God, which our sages of blessed memory explained. For this is the trait of mishpat, of justice. God judges on everything, he punishes every sin, and there is no escape. Now that end piece sounds like the curse that you should go to sleep with on your rumbling tummy on the eve of Yom Kippur after going home from Kol Nidre and Slichot and Vidui, but I see this as a comforting theology as well. Where's the comfort in this theology? It's this idea that in order for us to understand justice in this world as being complete, we cannot allow ourselves to hope that God would overlook the light sins of the righteous or even the good in this world, because what makes God perfect in God's mishpat, in God's justice in this world, is that everything gets passed under God's shepherding cane, right? We all pass before God, and all of our deeds pass before God. And if our little things didn't get seen, then so too might the little things of that other person who should be seen as well. No one gets overlooked. Everyone gets judged for everything. That is fairness and justice in the world. How many of us have had the experience of first frustration with a teacher, a coach, a boss, somebody else being in a position of power, who has frustrated us by holding us accountable for minor misdeeds or minor mistakes on our part, but then as part of a larger picture, seeing the fairness of that leader's perspective, because we see that they hold everybody accountable in the system, and then found gratitude in that system. There's frustration in that system, but there's so much fairness in that system too. And the hopefulness that lies therein is the hopefulness that there is ultimate fairness. There is no favoritism. Every one of us comes before God. Every one of us is seen. Our little things, our big things, nothing escapes. We are just present. Can we sneak one last one in? One last text? One last source? Great. Let's get one last one from Shmirat HaLashon. I'm going to ask that we skip partially down the page, and we're going to get to the part of the page that says, but certainly the creator of man. We'll go right to the English since we're short on time. But certainly the creator of man put it in the power of each and every Jew that if he only puts his eyes and his heart to his ways, he can avoid this. That is speaking Lashon Hara, which is the topic of this chunk of Shmirat HaLashon. As we find in Sifrei, in Parshat Hazinu, which is an ancient midrash on Parshat Hazinu, God is a God of trust without wrong. That is, God did not create men to be Risha'im, but to be Tzadikim. I'm going to repeat that. God did not create human beings to be evil, to be bad, but rather God created us to be Tzadikim. For if not so, there is wrong, God forbid, in the ordinance of the Blessed One, in the punishment that God metes out to them afterwards. This is the final thought, and this is what makes God a fair and perfect judge. This is what Shmirat HaLashon is saying. Here's what would be unfair. What would be unfair is if God created us to be wicked people and then came along and punished us for being wicked. But the Shmirat HaLashon says, that's not the case. God created us with plenty of yetzer, plenty of urge to do all sorts of things, and free will to do all sorts of things. But God created us to be tzaddikim. God created us to be righteous. And that's what makes the justice fair. And it's also what gives us the opportunity to face next year and promise that we can be our better selves, because God created us with the possibility and the hope to return to the selves that God made us to be, such that we can be those tzaddikim that God is hoping and wanting us to be. The mishpat is there as not just a consequence, but like a shepherd with their tools to hook us back in and to bring us back underneath God's guidance to say, come back, tzaddikim. Come back, righteous ones. I didn't create you to be wicked. I created you to be righteous. So justice is there to return us to our true selves, to return us to the righteousness that was intended to be our resting state, the goodness, the potential for goodness that exists within all of us. I don't intend to leave this resolved for any of you, not any of you who are listening live or anybody who listens to this on the podcast later. These are perspectives on God and God's mishpat. And I also leave it open-ended in a way that hopefully allows you to see that it is the custom and the tradition of Jews to wrestle with God's perfection as judge. It's hard. It's hard to imagine God as the perfect judge. But these are all doorways and windows, at least, to the possibility that there is perfection within justice in this world, that there are perspectives out there that might allow us to see ourselves as potential tzaddikim, to see God as a God of restraint, and to see the world out there as one in which fairness abounds cosmically. And I hope that that gives you a sense of hope leading towards this next Yom Kippur. And with that, I'll say Shabbat Shalom and Gemar Chatima Tova. And let us turn to our short Mariv to close out the evening, which begins on page 264 in Lev Shalem, 281 in the newer Sim Shalom, 200 in the older Sim Shalom. Remain seated and skip the Baruch Hu. Vihu rachum yikaber bo lo yashchit vir bal shiva po v'lo yair kol chamato Adonai Hoshea melech yaneinu b'yom koreinu baruch atah Adonai. Umavir yom umevi laila umavdil ben yom ufein laila Adonai tzavot shemo el chai v'kayam tamid himlo cholinu leolam vahed baruch atah Adonai amariv aravim havat shalom beit Yisrael. V'ahavatcha tasir mimenu le'olamim baruch atah Adonai ohev amo Yisrael el melech ne'eman Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai echad. Adonai Elohechem emet v'emunah kol zo v'kayam aleinu ki hu Adonai Eloheinu. U'malchut ha'beretzon kiblo lehem Moshe u'vnei Yisrael lechanu shira v'simcha rabba v'meru hulam mi chamocha b'elim Adonai מי כמוך נדר בקודש נורתי לא תוסיף אלה. מלכותך ראובנך בוקיים לפני משה, זה עליינו ויאמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר כבוד אדוני את יעקב, ויהיה לו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. השכיבנו אדוני אלינו לשלום אמן. ושמור צאתנו ואוהינו לחיים ושלום יתה ביד עולם, ברוך אתה אדוני שומר עמו ישראל עד. ברוך אדוני לעולם אמן ואמן. כי המלכות שלך היא עולם היד תמלוך וכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני המלך בכבודו תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד ועל כל מעשיו. We turn to the whispered private Amidah 270, 286, or 210. Please don't forget that in addition to the Havdalah paragraph, there are plenty of insertions for this week of the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days of repentance in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. If you haven't yet completed your Amidah, please continue at your own pace. We are on page 281 with Aleinu, or pages 297 or 696. Aleinu l'shabech l'adon hakor, v'tekiru l'adher separation shalom. Hakatuv b'torah Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed v'ne'emar v'haya Adonai l'melech al kol haaretz v'yamahu yeh Adonai echad u'shmo echad. We turn now to Psalm 27 for this season of Ah. It's on page 59 in Lev Shalem, and at the bottom of Aleinu, there should be an indication, whatever Siddur you're in, as to what page to turn to. Le David Adonai huri v'shimi mihira Adonai. Lilehim manti the repatu Adonai be'eretz chaim, kaveil Adonai chazak v'yamet tzlivecha, v'kaveil Adonai. Warner's Kaddish on 282, 298, 698. Yit gadal v'yit kadash shemei rabbah, v'yalma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute, v'chayechon v'yomechon u'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi Shemei Rabbah Mevarach Le'alam U'Almei Maya. Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitba'ar V'yitromam V'yitnaseh V'yithadar V'yitaleh V'yitalal Shemei Dekudesha Berichu Le'ela Mikol Birchata V'shirata Tishbechata V'nechamata Damiram Be'alma V'yimru Amen. Yehi Shlama Rabbah Min Shemaya V'chaim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'yimru Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. Invite you to grab your Havdalah sets. We'll do Havdalah together. All right. There we go. Hinei el Yeshuati Yiftach v'lo efcha Yuzi v'zimra Adonai v'hi Yeshua Shavta mayim v'zasamine Yeshua L'Adonai Yeshua l'macha Firchatach asala Adonai tzavot yanu miskav lanu Elohei Yaakov sala Adonai tzavot asher yada boteach bach Adonai Hoshea melech yaneinu v'yom korinu LaYehudim hayita ora v'simcha v'sason v'ikar Kei tichyev lanu kos Yeshuot esa u'v'shem Adonai ekra Saveri Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei peri hagafen Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei minei besamim Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei meorei ha'esh Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh lechol ben or lechoshek v'Yisrael amim ben yom hashvihi l'sheshet yemei hamaseh Baruch atah Adonai hamavdil ben kodesh lechol.
I hope it's not too hot on Yom Kippur with that outside service.
Me too.
because you can be in the shade, but if it's still like 85 degrees, people are going to get dehydrated because they won't be drinking water. That's my concern.
It wasn't so bad last year, I'll say. It
No, I
was
know.
pretty.
I'm saying if it's like 75, it'd be fine, but I just don't know what it's going to be. But I'm just saying I'm a little bit concerned because if everybody's outside because of COVID.
Yeah.
Then,
Well, let's pray for good weather.
Yeah.
And also this week we can hear you. Last week we couldn't hear you. Last when I wrote you that email. This is fine because we're not using the shul.
Oh, well, I'm glad that I'm here. Yeah, last week was not great sound, but I'm glad that you can hear me now. So, I know that the Nimoys really like singing a little Shavua Tov and Eliyahu Hanavi, so we're gonna do that, and Diane too. Okay, so Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hajishvi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Limera Veyamenu, Yavo Elinu, Imashiach ben David, Imashiach ben David, Shavua Tov, 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 Shavua Tov. Oh, I think that was backwards from how you usually do it. Shavua Tov, everybody. Hope it's a great week for everyone. Couple things. Number one, tomorrow, please join us 10 a.m. at the beach, our usual spot in Santa Monica, Reverse Tashlich, one of 160 communities across the country, doing Tikkun Hayam, cleaning up the beach. 10 a.m., people of all ages. It's going to be a wonderful, wonderful gathering. We have like 40 different families of all shapes and sizes. Family means lots of different things. And we are also experiencing a tremendous amount of loss right now in our community. We have 3 ongoing Shivas. So we have the Hirschhorn Shiva Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday this week. We have the Siegel Shiva tomorrow morning, 8:30, and then again on tomorrow evening, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And we also have the Budai Shiva, which has not been announced formally, but tomorrow evening, Monday evening, and Tuesday evening will also be at Isaac's mother's house, Zichronah Livracha, and coincidentally, that is just down the street from the Siegel home, literally down the block. So please keep your eyes on your emails. Try to make it to a minyan if you feel comfortable. Most of these are outdoor minyanim and very safely done. So we encourage you to take part in that and or daily minyan to make sure that all of these are robust minyanim throughout the week. And I hope to see you soon.
Rabbi, you said the same location, but when you look at the count, it says lifeguard 26. I think before it was lifeguard 5 or something. So I don't know if it's the same location.
I believe it is.
Maybe it is. Maybe it's always been 26.
Yeah, it is. It's lifeguard 26. It's always been. It's right by and 2600 Barnard Way, and it's the place right by Ocean Park at the beach, they call it, and Lot 5 South.
Okay, maybe that's
And hot tip for you all is that I believe they're still doing the thing. I could be wrong, but rather safe than sorry. A hot tip to bring $10 cash. I think that's still a thing there. That on Sunday mornings that they have the cash at the gate thing.
You have to
Could
pay?
be wrong.
Parking.
Yeah, with the parking. It may not be the case, but for years they've had it so that on Sunday mornings they transform it to $10 at the beach. If it's not that and it's the machines now again, fantastic. But we'll see you down there. We're going to get started with a short little ceremony and blow some shofar out at the beginning just to gather and hand out supplies. And then we'll be down there. Great. Shavua Tov, everyone. Great to see you.
Shavua Tov.
Bye.
Gemar Tov.
Marto.
Martov. Bye, Marlies.